Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. Tonight we're going to talk about hoof pads and kind of how we use them here in my everyday practice as well as with some therapeutic cases. Okay. So first of all, to think about pads, we often think of them as providing protection and support. They can obviously act as artificial sole or simply just increase the distance between the ground and the hoof. They provide support by essentially being a load-sharing mechanism, recruiting the sole and frog to bear some of the weight-bearing responsibilities that are normally borne solely on the wall. However, I think it is important to remember that the horse can perceive them as pressure and pain, so you can have a pad or packing material that can press on an already kind of compromised or painful area, resulting in pain or discomfort from the horse. Examples of this would be a thin-soled horse and the use of dense packing materials or very firm pads. Another example that we commonly run into would be horses with navicular syndrome or navicular disease that resent any pressure over their navicular apparatus or the area of their frog that is superficial to the navicular region. So it is very much an important thing that should be remembered with the application of any pad or any packing material. So there are many different types of pads out there nowadays. Leather is one of the older, the more common ones. It's not one that I use very much in my practice, but if you want to place something soft against a horse's hoof, it is very tough to beat just a good old leather pad. I do use a lot of plastic pads in my practice. A lot of people do not like to use plastic when you compare leather and plastic, because plastic doesn't allow the hoof to breathe or air or moisture to get in and out of the solar surface of the hoof as well as leather would. Nowadays we have a lot of urethane pads, so these would be kind of like our Equilox or the VetTech products that you actually pour into the bottom of the hoof. Rubber has been tried numerous times as a pad, and it works pretty well. However, having something in between the shoe and the hoof with as much kind of rebound or compress and expansion as rubber makes it a difficult one to keep on. We do have metal pads, which I think are often overlooked and probably an underused pad in our care for horses. Everyone knows about a hospital plate, but not a lot of people think about placing a metal pad between the shoe and the hoof, which could eliminate a lot of pressure from the ground and footing on injured or thin areas of the horse's hoof. When you talk about pads, not only with all those types, you can have different modifications of all those types. You can have full pads that cover the entire hoof. You can have partial pads that only cover certain portions of the horse's hoof. You could have rim pads that just go around the shoe itself. We have a lot of bar wedge pads or bar pads in general, which just mean that just the back is connected. We have frog pads, which would obviously cause the frog to bear more of the weight-bearing responsibility. We often use wedge pads. Sometimes this is just a little side note, but wedge pads sometimes get promoted as the cure-all for a lot of things, and then they also get discouraged from a lot of people because they don't like to use wedge pads or they think they cause ill effects to the horse's hoof. But simply when I talk about a wedge pad, is to do nothing but just raise the angle of the hoof, or hopefully use a wedge pad as a means to align the hoof pattern axis to a more parallel form. Okay. The pros of using pads are they do spread the load across the sole and the frog, so they take some of the weight-bearing responsibilities away from the wall. They do add protection. They are just another mechanical barrier between the hoof and the ground. They can provide added shock absorption based on your packing material, and I like to think of them as they can be used as a long-term bandage, okay, in certain situations. The downside to a pad is they can increase foot length. That meaning if you place a pad between a foot and the shoe, that does increase the overall length of the foot. That could make it easier for a horse to pull off or remove. But with the pour-in pads or the VetTech materials, you eliminate that. They can cause pressure, but I think with careful application and careful consideration of what horses you would use pads on and in what situations you can eliminate the pressure. They can trap dirt and debris, but I think if you use certain packing materials, you don't really run into that problem as much as if you just place a plastic pad over a hoof with no packing materials. They can encourage aerobic bacteria to growth and thrive, but I do think with the addition of copper sulfate, that eliminates a lot of that. They can seal, so if you use a pad over a healing abscess that is not completely healed, you could seal in more bacteria, exacerbating your abscess or prolonging the abscess process. And they can reduce traction. So in a lot of our sport horses, that is a huge consideration, is how do we apply a pad at the bottom of the hoof but still maintain our level of traction for their performance needs. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of packing materials on the market. The urethanes are the VetTech products. Luckily, they make a lot of products now of various densities that are very user-friendly. Silicone is one of my preferred methods, so just good old-fashioned window silicone mixed with copper sulfate and betadine and placed underneath the pad. We have a lot of impression materials or silicones that are two-part mixtures that you mix together, place under the pad, and they set up. Oakum is a very traditional hoof packing material that is, I still think, is very useful in today's world. Okay. So here's an example of the VetTech or Equipack products. This particular one is Equipack CS, or the one that's infused with copper sulfate. Now they have an Equipack Soft. They have the normal Equipack Clear, or the blue label. They also have silicone for people who like silicone. Comes in a two-part, obviously just like the VetTech or the Equipack. It squirts through the straw. This does not bond to the horse's hoof, so it must be used under a pad, whereas the Equipack CS or the just normal Equipack will bond to the hoof, and you don't necessarily have to use it underneath a leather or plastic pad. So this, again, is one of my preferred methods. It's very easy. It's very cheap. So this is just window silicone mixed with, again, betadine, copper sulfate. I think it makes a great packing material. It does allow some dirt and debris under the horse's hoof, so it doesn't seal as well as probably Equipack does. This is infused with copper sulfate, so I do think that this really helps keep a horse's hoof clean and healthy underneath the pad. So as you can see, when the little silicone insert's removed, there is a little bit of dirt and debris that has worked its way underneath the pad, but not a lot. So it does a pretty good job of keeping the bulk out. It provides something very soft through the toe region. You keep going, and this is just brushing off the dirt and debris, so you can see how the hoof is turned green. So that's where the copper sulfate is infusing into the foot. So it keeps it extremely clean. There's not really a lot of black, not a lot of bacteria. There's no smell associated with it. Very clean, very healthy underneath the pad. And this is a horse's hoof that has actually been in a pad for about 5 years now. And so it's extremely healthy, extremely normal under there. So I think sometimes pads get a bad rap because they can seal in, bacteria that can cause thrush problems or, not keep a frog as healthy as you would like. But again, I think with copper sulfate, you can absolutely maintain a healthy sole and a healthy frog beneath the pad. Okay. Again, this is some of the impression materials on the market. This particular one is from Sound Horse. And again, it's just a two-part silicone you mix together in a 1-to-1 ratio. And I do mix in copper sulfate with this, and it seems to work really, really well. Never seen a problem with it, having difficulty setting up or anything like that. It doesn't seem to affect the curing process at all. Okay. So these are or this is oakum, Venice turpentine, and copper sulfate. So again, this is another one of my preferred packing materials when you encounter a situation where you are afraid that you might seal in bacteria. The most common use for it in my practice is this is what I put beneath a pad to act as a long-term bandage on a horse with a healing abscess. So I think that this doesn't seal all that well. So it would allow drainage if the abscess did continue to drain. It's just we use it as just a protector, and we kind of a long-term bandage. So this is what it looks like when it's mixed up. There's no scientific ratio. Just you peel apart some of the oakum, pull the fibers apart, mix it with Venice turpentine and copper sulfate, and that's what I use directly beneath the pad. So instead of just talking about a certain pad for a certain situation, I decided to kind of go through some cases with you guys and where I commonly use pads in my practice. Hopefully that'll keep it a little more interesting than just a dry example of a leather pad is used for this situation, a wedge pad is used for this situation. So the firsts are probably the most common use of pads in my practice is still for weak or thin-walled, particularly our performance horses. So event horses still make up the bulk of my practice. So this is not an uncommon foot for those event horses to have. So it's very weak, very thin, very shelly hoof wall. So we do like to use pads to share the load across the sole and the frog. Okay. So this is a particular situation where traction is of the greatest concern. So one way we work on that is with the use of Equipack. So this is the pour-in pad material. I don't know if it shows up on the screen very well, but from about this point forward, it's tipped down so the rim of the shoe is still exposed. So only the heel surface is all the way to the ground. So this would still allow a great deal of traction for this horse. The Equipack is very easy for owners, riders, trainers, whoever to peel out if they want to have the pad for the majority of their training, but pull it out for cross country when they need the most traction. And then it's a product that's easy enough for owners or riders or trainers to squirt in later, or for the farrier to come back and apply at a later date as well. So it's something that can go in and out fairly easily, although it is a little expensive. Okay, another way we use pads with the event horses to try to maintain as much traction as possible is simply just a flat pad, again with a silicone beneath it, but this still allows the entire rim of the shoe to be exposed. So there is still a fair amount of traction with this, though there is a little bit of a reduction in the amount of traction they have. And then to move on, in our chronic laminitics, we often use pads because it's not uncommon for them to be very thin-soled. So you can see here this particular horse has about 8 millimeters of sole depth, and so the sole depth on a horse really provides a lot of comfort. So when they get this thin, they are obviously very uncomfortable. So pads work as kind of instant sole. They definitely increase the distance between the ground and the hoof. So on this particular case, we used a Sound Horse Sigafoo shoe. It comes with a rim pad, so that automatically gets the foot further off the ground. And then we often use that in combination with Equipack. So this particular one was poured all the way to the ground surface, so it's instant artificial sole for this horse. Okay. But we're also using these pads as kind of a protector or mechanical barrier to the damaged or stretched white line on these horses. So you can see these black tracks here. These are obviously very easy places for dirt and debris to pack along with bacteria and result in an abscess. Okay, so this particular horse did have an abscess, but if your shoe doesn't cover this entire area, a pad can often be used as just a mechanical barrier to prevent dirt and debris and bacteria from packing in those places. So this is obviously an abscess that is down the road to recovery. So this is about 7 to 10 days after it was drained, and so at this point it was obviously kept in a bandage, kept clean and dry. So, but obviously owners don't want to bandage every single day, so we use our pads as kind of a long-term bandage. Okay, and so this particular one was a frog pad, so naturally that recruits the frog to carry more of the load than the sole and share some of the weight-bearing responsibilities from the wall. From about this point forward, we filled it with oakum, Venice turpentine, and copper sulfate, packed in that hole of the abscess to keep it clean and free of any dirt and debris, but hopefully have no fear of sealing that area. And then the use of silicone in the back to try to seal the back to allow or reduce the chance of dirt and debris from packing beneath the pad. Another common place we use pads are with our navicular horses. Okay. So we use this particular shoe is again one of the Sound Horse Series 1 shoes. This is the Morrison open wedge shoe. So you can see they've used urethane to make a slight gradual wedge. Okay. And I'm not saying that all navicular horses should wear a wedge pad. I'm just saying it should be used to align the hoof pastern axis. So that's what we chose to use for this particular horse. And then with some navicular horses, you get away with using a full pour or pouring all the way to the ground. So this provides a lot of protection, a lot of shock absorbing in the palmar half of the foot where the horse would resent pressure. But it's not uncommon for those horses to resent having that much, protection or support in that area. They sometimes do perceive that as pressure. So sometimes we take and actually, kind of indent or impress the Equipack in the area that would hurt the horse. So that way it's kind of floating. And we simply do that by making a small insert that looks like this. So it's just the foam boards that come from VetTech. They have a frog cut out on what's going to be the shoe surface of the pad. And we simply just stick it to the we stick it to the bottom of the shoe and then just squirt the Equipack in from the bottom. And this leaves the little indention or hopefully takes away some of the pressure over that navicular area where the horse would resent pressure. Okay. But still providing some of the shock absorbing, some of the protection in the palmar half of the foot. Okay. Another place where we commonly use pads are, again, with cracks of all kinds. So we occasionally see toe cracks like this. The only way to treat them would be to bride them, dress back, this long lever out here that's exacerbating our crack. And when doing that, we take away a great deal of hoof wall. So the horse needs added support, added protection when you dress it back this far, this hard. So we use oftentimes a full pour, a full Equipack, again, to spread the load away from the injured wall onto the sole of the frog. Okay. So with quarter cracks, again, they're not an uncommon injury in a lot of our sport horses. Okay. So again, to treat those, oftentimes we float out that area or the injured area with a rim pad. I prefer, again, to use plastic, but we simply just cut away the area that's injured or we don't want to be bearing the weight. And then when you float it that way, you obviously have to spread that load somewhere, so we choose to spread it over the sole and the frog. Occasionally we do decide to increase the pressure on the frog over the sole and the wall. So this particular frog pad or this frog mold that we've made from the Equipack extends below the surface of the shoe to require the frog to carry more of the load. So again, we simply make that with those VetTech foam boards, making the little frog insert. And then again, just squirting it in the back. Okay. And nowadays, with our performance horses, we're seeing a lot of tendon and ligament lesions, and we're seeing the use of asymmetrical shoes to treat those injuries fairly commonly nowadays. It is possible to use pads to do some of the same effect, maybe not to the exact same extent, but a particular pour like this that's full at the toe and taper to the heel, would favor the toe to float in soft footing, causing the heels to sink a little further. So this is kind of the setup we would use for a horse with a suspensory issue to allow the heels to sink more so than the toe. So here you can see how it's just tapered down at the heel, but again full at the toe, all the way to the ground surface. We have a lot of the collateral ligament injuries in our sport horses. So again, the asymmetrical shoe to encourage flotation on one side, sinking on the other. So the use of a pad that's poured all the way to the ground surface on one half of the shoe, tapered on the other side. Again, favoring the one side to float and the other side to sink. Okay. Again, this one would be kind of the heel plate with the toe sunk in, so this would encourage the heel to float and the toe to sink. So this would be for like a deep digital flexor tendon injury. This particular setup was used for, again, the hind end of an event horse with a negative palmar angle. So we used a wedge pad to align that or improve this palmar angle, and again recess the toe area, hopefully to maintain our traction needs. Okay. So with teratomas, again, they're an area where we do use a lot of pads. Okay. So teratoma obviously is a benign growth beneath the hoof capsule, between the hoof capsule and the distal phalanx. So treatment for it is obviously to have it removed. So essentially you have a large area of resection. Okay, so we have a large piece of the horse's hoof wall that gets removed. Okay, it no longer bears weight like it normally should, so that load should be transferred somewhere, and we choose to transfer it again to the back half of the foot or increase the weight-bearing responsibilities of the sole of the frog. So this particular horse had an abscess on the other foot, and so when you do a surgery like that, or you're concerned with one injured limb, it's important to pay attention to the other foot, because you're constantly worried about contralateral limb laminitis. Unfortunately, this one had an abscess on the other foot, so we're again worried about using a full pour, a full Equipack to provide the most support to that digit. So we chose to use, again, a plastic pad with a combination of packing materials. So at the toe, this is filled with the oakum, the Venice turpentine, and copper sulfate. And again, with the back half of the foot poured with the Equipack, hopefully providing as much support to that limb as we can, because we would have the fear after the surgery that this limb would have to do the majority of the weight-bearing responsibilities. And when that occurs, you must be worried about contralateral limb laminitis. Moving on, canker. So this is obviously a pretty severe case, and this is a case where it would be very, very apparent not to cover this with a pad. So this is one of the places where people can get into trouble with pads, and even in a much less, a lesser disease process would be thrush. It's definitely something you don't want to cover with a pad or seal. It will obviously only get worse. Okay. So with canker, obviously the cure for it is, again, to cut it away, the healthy frog or healthy dermis. Okay. So again, this is a very thin area, and so this is obviously, a very weakened area. This is a very sensitive area, so this is one where pads would absolutely cause pressure and pain and discomfort to the horse. Okay? So this is where you would use something like a hospital plate, again, to allow treatment to that area, and again, to prevent force to that sensitive area. Okay? The hospital plate is simply a metal pad attached to the ground surface of a shoe, but I do think that metal pads are, not used as much as they possibly could. You could easily take the same materials that we build a hospital plate out of and build a pad that goes beneath the hoof and between the shoe. Okay? That would prevent a lot of force from the ground up on an injured area. So as the frog or the dermis is healing, keratinizing, getting stronger, at some shoeings, when we decide to remove the hospital plate, we oftentimes will use a metal pad, again, to just prevent force to that sensitive area. but a metal pad could obviously be used with a thin or a weak sole that you're worried about pressure to a particular area. A metal pad can be used when you're worried about the pressure over the navicular area causing pain or lameness to a horse. So lots of use for metal pads, even though they're not all that common. Okay? The active abscess is obviously, again, another place where you definitely do not want to use a pad. Only after the abscess has been drained, fully had a chance to begin to heal, would you use a pad as a long-term bandage. But that should be at least 7 to 10 days down the road after the initial drainage. So once the abscess looks more like this is obviously a time where it's fairly healthy. This is the time where you would use the pad as kind of a long-term bandage. Okay? And again, that area would be packed with something that would allow it to drain or not completely seal. So we do choose to use the oakum, thinnest turpentine, and copper sulfate. Okay? So in summary, pads provide protection and support, and I think with a little creativity, they could be used in a lot of situations. To provide relief or comfort to horses. However, it is very critical to remember that pads can cause pressure and pain, not just protection and support. So any questions?
All right, fantastic. Great job, Travis. Yeah, we have quite a few questions already. A reminder, if you got in here a little late and you have a question about something Travis covered, or maybe your own question, something you didn't quite get to regarding pads, you'll see on the control panel there's a section where you can type in your questions, and we'll go through as many as possible. So let's begin. There's a question here regarding your using the silicone packing. Any tips on using that, since it's more of a hardware store application than something you might get at the local supply shop?
Any tips on it?
Yeah.
Well, I'd say, yeah. Well, the cheapest place to get it is Walmart, and you can buy it for about $1.97 a tube. So it's very cheap. The only thing is obviously silicone does take a long time to cure or set up, but with a few drops or a few milliliters of betadine, it will work as a catalyst and cause it to set up very, very quickly. Well, I guess I shouldn't say very, very quickly, but rapidly enough that you could put it in the bottom of a foot, nail a shoe on, go to the other foot, smear it on there, nail the shoe with the pad on there. By the time you get done trimming, shoeing, finishing the hind feet, the front feet, the silicone will be set up. So it will markedly increase the, or decrease the amount of time it takes for the silicone to cure with the use of just a little bit of betadine.
Do you find that plastic wedge rims or bars tend to crush heels more than leather pads?
I don't think either one crushes heels more so than the other. I think they do get a bad rap as crushing heels because we like to wedge with rim pads, and the frog is left unsupported or floating in the air. So I think anytime you wedge a foot, you should absolutely have frog support or cover the frog with either a heart bar or heel plate, something to cause the frog to carry some of the weight away from the heels. And oftentimes I think that wedge pads are used improperly. With the use of a wedge pad, it is crucial to trim the heel down to as healthy of a margin as you possibly can. And again, trying to trim the heels as far back as you possibly can, hopefully to the highest, widest point of the frog, and then apply the wedge pad. So if you have a weakened or a folded over or already underrun heel, and then all you do is simply apply a wedge pad to it, it is just going to exacerbate the problem.
Here's a question that's a bit more philosophical. It came in right before we began, so I'm going to tinker with it a bit. We've gone through a lot of the pros and cons regarding pad use, but in terms of how adding a pad to a horse can affect its movement, what are some of the things you look for? What are you measuring, and what sort of things do you use to justify continued use of a certain pad?
Well, I think the continued use of a pad would be obviously if a horse is uncomfortable, a horse is lame, and you use a pad and the horse becomes more comfortable. Obviously, that would be a good indication to continue the use of the pad. Obviously, like I said earlier, pads can increase foot length, so they can, alter a horse's gait or a horse's movement. You particularly see that in the gaited horse world, which is definitely beyond the scope of my practice. Um, so, yeah, I don't know. Does that answer the question or not?
Well, yeah, I think, well, we got a few other questions. I think it would sort of touch on the subject in terms of some of your philosophy on using. Uh,
Uh-huh.
but let's go ahead to a few others. Here's one directly. Why do you opt for turpentine versus pine tar?
Just personal preference. I've honestly never really used much pine tar. Always used Venice turpentine. I would
Why are you,
imagine pine tar would do just as good of a job.
okay. Why are you setting a horse up with suspensory issues to let the heel sink?
Because so with a suspensory issue, you would let the heel sink, so there would have increased tension on the deep digital flexor tendons. You would ask the deep digital flexor tendon to carry some of the strain.
This question will survey some of the pads you discussed, some that maybe you just addressed shortly at the beginning. Can you discuss a little bit how moisture affects pads? And in addition to that, there's a follow-up question on how uh, does the horse lose any sensitivity by wearing pads?
I don't know if a horse loses any sensitivity. I guess you could argue that by covering the frog, you could have, decreased sensitivity, and maybe they don't have as much feeling in the back half of their foot as normal. I'm not sure about that. Moisture does affect pads, and you often see that in the leather pads. And so if you apply a shoe with a leather pad dry to a horse's hoof, and then that horse or that hoof or pad comes into contact with moisture, it'll obviously swell, and then compress, and then you have a lot of problems with your clinches popping up. So in my practice, if I do nail on a leather pad, I just go ahead and soak it in water immediately before nailing it on for 5-10 minutes, and then nail it on, so it will already go on kind of compressed, and that does eliminate some of the movement there causing the clinches to pop up.
Okay. Hey, we have a few more questions, so if you have anything, be sure to type it in and take advantage of having Travis on here. Travis, can you describe a situation in which you'll use bar wedges with frog support?
Well, the most common time that I would use bar wedges with frog support would be on the hind end of a horse with a negative palmar angle. So again, just trying to improve or increase that palmar angle. Again, just trying to align the hoof pasture axis. But the frog pad or the frog insert on that, again, is just hopefully not wedging up a foot and leaving the frog suspended in air. They like to keep the frog in contact with the ground. So when we elevate it off the ground, we use a frog insert or Equipack or something, again, to have the ground be able to touch the frog or the frog be able to touch the ground.
If you have a horse that needs to work in water, what pad would you recommend?
That needs to work in water,
Mm-hmm.
like an event horse going through a water jump.
Sure, let's use that as an example.
Okay, so if I had to do that, I would prefer a plastic pad or Equipack. Again, anytime a horse is going to come into a contact with a lot of moisture, again, I kind of shy away from leather.
Let's see here. Let's see. How about do you have any problems, or what transitional advice would you have for bringing a horse out of pad after extended use?
After extended use, if you're worried about them becoming very sensitive with the pad off, you could go from, like let's say you start with Equipack, which is a fairly dense packing material. You could move it down to like silicone, which would cause more stimulation to the hoof, being a less dense packing material. You could go from Equipack silicone to then barefoot, or open, foot, you could absolutely, if you're really worried about it, take whatever packing material you use, whether it's silicone or, a pressure material or Equipack, whatever, and you decide you want to take it out, you could gradually do that by, putting in the Equipack, but without mesh or anything that's going to trap it in there, and then allow the owner to take it out, let the horse have, a few hours a day without it, then put the pad back in, and then slowly increase the time the horse has without the pad. But in reality, I haven't seen too many cases where, once whatever we were trying to treat or, compensate for, after that heals or becomes more normal, I haven't really seen a problem with removing a pad.
Okay, we have one last question here. In your experience, have you ever had oakum shift or bulk up in an area under the pad and then cause some pressure?
I've never really had it shift, or bulge up. That would be a concern with any of the packing materials. Would be hopefully to prevent any bulging or pinpoint pressure from any of the packing materials. But oakum, particularly pulled apart in its individual strands, is extremely, extremely soft. And so even if there was a slight bulge, I don't know that it would be a problem. But if you lay it in there fairly flat and evenly over the horse's hoof and then cover it with a pad, I really haven't had problems with bulging.